You're going to learn 10 crucial chess principles from this position right here. This was a game played recently in 2024 between Ali Reza Firouzja and Parham Maghsoodloo, round 2 of the Tata Steel 2024 chess tournament. And I'm going to show you how we ended up in this position, and then we're going to jump right in to the 10 principles. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a Ruy Lopez and a Berlin defense, which a lot of the times leads to some boring and dull draws. But I like the way that Firouzja approached this, and he went for this line, which I personally have never seen before, but he sacrificed a couple of pawns early on. So right here, notice the tension between these two rooks, and also the pressure on the pawn, and Firouzja just leaves it alone. He just plays bishop to f4, and eventually black does grab this pawn. Now, he doesn't right away, because if you take this now, you run into some issues with the doubled pawns here. That's pretty awkward for black. So he decides to save the knight first, move that away. And instead of defending this pawn with some move like c3, white plays knight c3, just gambiting the pawn, just so that he can go on the offensive with knight to d5. And he's actually gambiting 2 pawns by doing this. So very interesting approach, but I like the dynamic position that arises from this. So here we go, grabs the second pawn, rook goes to b1, and bishop to e5. All right, so here we go. This is the critical position that we're going to start talking about, and we're going to go through these 10 principles. So before I tell you what principle number 1 is, if you would like to pause, what do you think white played in this position? All right, we've had a chance to look at that. Principle number 1 is use your pawns to dislodge your opponent's pieces. And in this case, if you look carefully, this bishop is kind of like a monster. I mean, it's just controlling a lot of important squares. It's very well defended. It's blocking off the queen from infiltrating this way. I can't draw. There we go. I couldn't draw my arrows for a second. So he dislodges it with a pawn move. F4. I mean, it seems kind of obvious once you see it, right? But this is a very important concept to keep in your mind. If your opponent has a strong piece somewhere, if you can attack it with a pawn, that's a really easy way to make it move, right? And it kind of can solve some of your problems. So that's the first principle that we see. And here black plays bishop to e6. You can see it's not the greatest move, but the question is why? So if you would like to pause, what do you think white played here? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, this brings us to principle number 2, which is don't trade when you're attacking. So remember, white sacrificed 2 pawns to get an aggressive position. They're trying to make use of that. And by simply taking this bishop, which I think a lot of people would do, you're just going to be trading. So for example, you take this, but you lose your knight. And yes, you can take here, but then black recaptures. And what did you accomplish? Nothing really. There's no follow-up. And remember, you only have 4 pawns and black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 because you sacrificed 2 pawns. So don't just trade when you're trying to play an aggressive position. You have to find a better move. And if you're wondering, the better move here brings us to principle number 3, which is take advantage of open diagonals. So if you look at this position, this diagonal right here, notice how the king is on it and it's open. There's no pawn that's blocking that off. So what does white play? Bishop to c4. He's lining up not only on the bishop, which is undefended, but also on the king, which can be a problem. So for example, if black tries to, let's just say, trade here, well, now white can capture with check and then still grab the bishop at the end. So he prevents black from actually trading. Remember, when you're trying to defend against an attack, trading is good. And white prevents that with this very powerful move, bishop to c4. Okay, so let's see what happens. Black plays bishop to d4 check because they did have a problem of, your bishop's under attack, but you're about to lose this one behind it. So he finds a check to at least buy him some time to save the bishop on e6. So king to h1, bishop to f7. And this brings us to principle number 4. If you would like to pause, what do you think white played here? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, actually, this brings us to principle 4 and 5. Principle number 4 is don't always just pawn grab, look for a more powerful move. So I think a lot of people in this position would be very tempted to say, okay, well, at least I can get one of my pawns back here. It's undefended. I finally have the opportunity. Let me go ahead and grab that pawn. And that is not what white played. And you can see as one example, after a move like bishop to b6, all of a sudden your rook is kind of stuck back there. And what exactly are you going to do? Yeah, you can take here, but look at it. It's still kind of trapped, right? It's not really what you want. And so don't always just grab pawns, especially when you're playing in an aggressive attacking position. Look for something stronger, okay? And then principle number 5 is centralize your queen when you have the opportunity to do so. So the move that was played here was queen to e4. And by centralizing the queen, you can see how much more powerful it becomes. It was already pretty good, right? Controlling this e file and a lot of important squares. But on e4, now you have an attack on the bishop. Now you have a defender to your knight and to your pawn if you need that. And more importantly, you're also attacking the king as well. And this might not seem like an important feature, but this is very important. And you're going to see why in just a second. So queen to e4. Black plays, excuse me, bishop to c5. And if you would like to pause, this brings us to principle number 6. All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, the sixth principle is always be scanning for tactics. So when you're playing in a position like this, you want to keep all these other ideas in mind, but you also want to be scanning for tactics so that at the right moment, you can jump in and deliver a tactical idea, right? And that's what we see here. Knight to e7 check. And I want to point out, going back here, if white would have played knight to e7 check right here, it's not so good because the king can just go to f8. You don't want to go to the corner because then you lose the defense of the bishop. But you can just go to f8 and there's not really any problems for black. I mean, this is great. Now the knight has to move and white's kind of in trouble. But by going queen e4 first, attacking the bishop, forcing that to move, and then going knight to e7, now it's different because remember that queen attacking the h7 pawn that I mentioned? Now you can see why it's it's a much more powerful move because after king to f8, guess what? That pawn is undefended. And that's exactly what he does. He grabs the pawn. All right, now this brings us to principle number 7 and 8. And let me show you what black played first here. Black captured that bishop. Now it's white to play. And if you'd like to pause, go ahead. All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, principle number 7 is use all of your pieces. See, a lot of times when people attack like this, they get tunnel vision and they only can think about one section of the board. And they think, okay, I've got a bishop, I've got a knight, and I've got a queen. I have to make this work somehow with these pieces, and they'll forget about other pieces like the rook sitting over here on b1. You need to use all of your pieces, and that's exactly what we see here. Firouzja plays rook to e1. He activates all of his pieces. Very, very important. Also, principle number 8 is you want to block the king's escape route. We've talked about this before, but when you're attacking, you don't want to allow the king a place to just run away. Now that this light squared bishop has disappeared, this is much more appealing route for the king to run and hide, and you don't want to allow that. So rook to e1 puts a stop to that right away, cuts off the king's escape route, and he's starting to use all of his pieces. Now, I just want to point out briefly here, there are some tactics that you would have had to see, like what's going to happen if the queen simply takes my knight if I do this. These aren't super difficult. If you want to pause, what would the follow-up be here? If you had a chance to look at that, queen h8 check forces the bishop, and then you capture with checkmate. So that's pretty straightforward, but you would need to calculate that before you could go grab this pawn like this. And then the other one would be if the king takes, what would you play here? If you had a chance to look at that, again, it's the rook coming over, and it forces the king either to go back and get checkmated just like we saw, or to come over here, and then you lose the bishop, and you have all kinds of problems here as black, and black's position's falling apart. So, of course, you know, white would have calculated that, and that's why black decided to avoid that and instead go for the capturing the bishop over here. All right, so back to the game. Rook to e1, remember, activating all the pieces and cutting off the king's escape route. And black actually decides to sacrifice the queen, because if you don't do that, you really have no way to stop this checkmate idea. Okay, like any other move, this is going to happen. Check and checkmate. Oops, sorry, not f8. That's not checkmate. Queen g8, checkmate. Okay, so because black couldn't stop that, they said, all right, let me go ahead and cut my losses. At least I'll get rid of these two pieces and go into this position. Now, the interesting thing about this position is if you look at the material, bishop, bishop, you've got the queen against a rook, a knight, and a bishop. Now, just from a material standpoint, those three pieces should be better than the queen. If you add up all the points, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and the queen is only 9 points. However, there are two things that are working in white's favor. Number one is primarily that the king is exposed and in danger of getting checkmated or having to defend the king. And number two, there's actually a tactic immediately available where white can get some material back. So if you would like to pause, what's the move here for white? All right, if you had a chance to look at that, it's just the simple queen e4 check. It's a fork And you might say, well, Nelson, they can just block with the bishop, which is what was played in the game, but now you have a follow-up tactic to actually win the bishop. Very straightforward. You simply attack it with a pawn. This is a good thing to remember when you're pinning a piece. If you could attack it with a pawn, it's a very simple and easy way to just be able to capture it next move because it can't move, right? It's pinned. So that's what was played. And we have rook to d8, and this brings us to principle number 9. What do you think white played here? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, he could have just taken the bishop. This would be okay. There's nothing wrong with just grabbing the bishop. The game's going to go on. White's still in a pretty nice position. But he actually finds an even better move, the move g4. And the principle here is trade your pawns to unleash your pieces. If we look at this position, of course, the queen is very powerful, doing a lot of great stuff. The bishop, not so much. I mean, yeah, it's sitting here, but that's defended. Like, otherwise, what are you going to do with your bishop? I don't really think you want to move it back here, right? So what does he do? He pushes the pawn because he knows that if he trades this off, all of a sudden that bishop becomes much more powerful. This is very, very important. When you have pieces that are blocked by pawns, if you have the opportunity to trade the pawns, go do it, right? And that's what we see here. And also, this isn't going anywhere. It's still pinned. He can take this later if he needs to. And so he's not worried about that opportunity going away at the moment. So c6, and he continues with the plan, pushing the pawn to trade it off. King moves, and now he takes it, right? Because now the king is out of the way. The bishop was free to move, and he doesn't want that to get away, so now he finally takes with the pawn. King goes back because what else is black going to do? Otherwise, the pawn was going to push forward there, and it was going to cause all kinds of problems. And then we see the trade. And notice, not only does he increase the effectiveness of the bishop, he also opens up the queen over here on h7. And so you can see how powerful trading off those two pawns was, right? That was a great idea to play g4, g5. So very, very important there. All right, so we just have one more principle to look at. So let me go ahead through the next couple of moves here. He brings the queen in. He goes ahead and trades off that bishop. And right here, this brings us to principle number 10. What do you think white played here? All right, if you had a chance to look at that, he played the move h4, which brings us to principle number 10, push your passed pawns. He's already got a good position, but it's not over just yet. The rook and the knight can actually be kind of annoying and defend and blockade and eventually maybe capture this, but they're going to have a problem with this pawn because it's so far away. Knights are bad at stopping outside passed pawns. The king is cut off. The rook is kind of tied up, helping out over here. And so he just pushes the pawn. It's just the simplest and easiest way to finish the game, and yet I think a lot of people would get confused here and start going for different checks, which are not necessarily bad, but if you have a passed pawn like this, a lot of times that's the easiest thing that you can do. All right, and that's what we see here, and a few moves later, black resigned, right? It's just too much. The queen is very powerful. This pawn is coming. How do you stop it? It's being defended here. You've got to watch out for forks and all kinds of other things, and so the game is just over. So hopefully you guys learned something. 10 crucial chess principles from a real Grandmaster game. If you liked this video, you'll also like this one, which is very similar but different principles and a different game. Thank you guys, and I'll see you next time. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.